Yaman Dumarang, I hope you're well today, as a, as it has been for the last three videos. My name's Alison Barnes, and I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman. Today, I'm joining from the traditional lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people here in the beautiful Blue Mountains, just west of Sydney. And as always, I'd like to thank them for their ongoing connection to and care for country, waterways, and community. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any other First Nations person who is watching, whenever you are watching. So today we're going to be talking about housing and the social determinants of health, having a bit of a focus on the economic determinants of health. Um, this is an old tin house. You flatten out the kerosene tins, use them like shingles. This, I believe, was the photo that I stole from the internet is labelled as the house at the gully. If it's not at the gully, it's very similar to photos of houses I've seen from the gully when it was an Aboriginal community, kind of like a town camp up at Katoomba. If your house is just made from flattened kerosene tins and you're in Katoomba, do you think that's appropriate housing? They're usually one room, two if you're lucky, but usually only one room. Um, and they're made from tin. It's not a great insulator. And this is the Blue Mountains. It's always been cold. It probably always will be. Um, well, that's a debate, but anyway. So it's not really appropriate housing. Even back in the 50s, Aboriginal families were a bit bigger than the average Australian family. So one room, lots of kids. And as happened in the gully, let me just go back to that video, that slide. No. Okay. And as happened at the gully, the council decided that they needed to do something to improve tourism in the Blue Mountains. One of the things that was suggested was, we've got all this lovely land at the gully, let's redevelop it. So they kicked all of the inhabitants off the land. Again, this was in the 1950s, not that long ago. So the practice of forcibly removing Aboriginal people from their homes has been ongoing in this country from the very beginning, and it continues. Anyway, so there's a bit of a history. So in the time before colonisation, which I like to think of as the time BC, it's a joke, but anyway, in the time before colonisation, Aboriginal people lived in nation groups who had a defined area of land. Within those nation groups, there were family groups that also had a defined area of land. So this model of hunter-gatherer societies that people like to say, not necessarily true. People didn't wander aimlessly across the countryside looking for something to eat. That's not how it worked. People had defined areas where they could manage the resources to ensure that they had a continuous supply of food over the course of the year, depending on weather conditions and seasons and all of the things that influence food production. Then the colonisers came. And in the early days of the colony, it's quite well known. Lots and lots of Darug and Eora people, depending on which side of that argument you sit on, who lived in and around the harbour, died within the first decade or so. Sometimes that was from diseases like influenza, which was, it's an airborne droplet transmission. People cough, sneeze, splutter, whatever. if you're in the vicinity, you are at risk of exposure to that disease. Other times, diseases like smallpox were transmitted to Aboriginal people who, again, have no natural immunity via infected blankets. People like to say, oh, that was an accident. They didn't mean to do it. But there were no reported cases of active smallpox on the First Fleet during the journey from England to Australia. So how did it get there? The surgeons on the ships had vials of the material from smallpox that's used to inoculate people against it. Anyway, that's just what happened. When they came and they moved people off, they realised having Aboriginal people just sitting around on the streets was terribly attractive, and also slightly inconvenient. They were drunk and noisy and what have you. So that began the process of confining people, moving people into designated areas. It was soon realised that even if you move people into camps or missions, there needed to be some sort of administration around that, which began the period of protectionism, because the Aboriginal people were not Aboriginal people needed to be looked after. So there began this time of protectionism. Often it wasn't the Aboriginal people being looked after. That was the case. They just wanted to move people onto missions, have them run by the government. So Aboriginal people had no control over where they lived, who they lived with, or who they married, whether or not their kids went to school, where they went to school, any of that stuff. The government needed to be in control of that, or the mission societies or churches, groups or whatever. Also made it easier for people to force the idea of assimilation onto Aboriginal people, because if you renounced your indigeneity, you could get an exemption certificate and be allowed to move off the mission, but you could never go back. Kind of sounds familiar. But anyway, also in the name of assimilating, they wanted to remove fair-skinned children from their parents so that they could be raised the right way or the white way, which were the same thing, either in children's homes or as adoptees or foster children in private homes. We all know how well that worked out for Aboriginal people. But anyway, after the assimilation period and the idea that you could just smooth the dying pillow, let the Aboriginal, the primitive Aboriginal race just die out. It's a kindness for them, really. That didn't work out well for them either, did it? Because it's actually much harder to do than you imagine. Even when you look like me, you still feel it in your heart. Anyway, after assimilation came a period of self-determination with the civil rights movement. In the movement in America in the 50s and 60s, Aboriginal people started asking, if it can work for them, why can't it happen for us? And then there was the referendum in 1967, and after that came a whole range of organisations, starting with the Aboriginal Medical Service in Redfern in 71, that were Aboriginal controlled and operated organisations designed to service the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Self-determination isn't always just about politics. It can be about the things that we need, getting the things that we need from the people who can deliver it to us in a culturally safe and competent way. Housing for Aboriginal people after we kind of got a bit of self-determination back, started to move towards away from missions and towards tenancy, generally speaking through public housing, but there was the establishment of the Aboriginal Housing Office and other organisations, but it was tenancy. People were locked into lifelong tenancy. Moving forward, I think we need to investigate a range of ways to help us Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience the great Australian dream, just like everybody else. And even if people don't want to own a house, because that whole ownership thing can be challenging culturally, even if you don't want to own somewhere, you need to be able to find ways to offer people secure, uninterrupted tenancy so that people can develop a community and build relationships and live in a culturally safe way. There are some issues around housing for Aboriginal people. This is a rock shelter. It's about 20 minutes from here at Shaw's Creek. It is there is archaeological evidence to suggest that this shelter has been inhabited by humans for about 25,000 years. Where's my hand? That rock shelter has, had people camping, visiting 25,000 years. Anyway, back to the point in hand, issues around housing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, economics, clearly, we'll talk about that in more detail. There's racism within the housing system, particularly in relation to private rental accommodation, or even I've heard stories about people buying and selling houses and having problems doing that because of their Aboriginality. I had a real estate agent before we moved up here to the mountains who came to my house to have a look at it and talk about whether or not what he could do for me in terms of being my real estate agent to sell. And he actually suggested to me that I take the Aboriginal artwork I had on the walls down, because people might not like to buy from an Aboriginal. Apparently, he did not get the job. And every opportunity I have to say, well, how bad he is at his job, I tell people, like now. But it happens. And it's not great. We also have, as I mentioned a moment ago, we have Aboriginal people, they're kind of locked into this idea of living in social housing for the rest of their lives. And in some ways, I have no problem with that if that's what people need to do. But there are problems with social housing, such as the ghettoisation of Aboriginal people and social housing being run by people who don't understand the cultural and social needs of Aboriginal people. That is an issue that needs to be dealt with. And there's been ongoing issues with some housing not being looked after properly. There are also issues around affordability. As we all know, private rentals in Sydney vastly problematic. And a lot of Aboriginal people exist on fairly low incomes, so that's not appropriate for them. We also need to think about what is culturally appropriate housing. Aboriginal communities are considered youthing populations by demographers and people who understand what all that stuff. Um, that just means our population, Aboriginal society, there's more young people than old people. Um, so in practice, that means we have larger families, and we may end up in situations where we have issues of overcrowding, not because anyone's doing anything wrong, but just because, um, you know, I have a friend who has 7 kids. You can't have 7 kids comfortably in a teeny tiny 3-bedroom townhouse. It's just not possible, especially when there's only one bathroom. Um, and that situations where there's overcrowding leads you as a parent to being exposed to um, social services like Department of Communities and Justice in ways that Aboriginal people would really rather avoid. So what about the economics makes housing an issue for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Many Aboriginal people are now in our younger population, people my age and younger, have been able to go to finish school and go to university or complete trades or develop skills in some other way. But there's still a lot of our community who live on very low fixed incomes. So private rentals become unobtainable, not just unaffordable, but simply unobtainable. There's a lack of intergenerational wealth that can make it hard for young people to get a foot on the housing ladder in any kind of way that isn't social housing. People, there was a news report just last week about young people relying on the bank of mum and dad to get onto the property, into the property market, onto the ladder. Our young people tend not to have that opportunity because their parents never had the opportunity to build wealth themselves. As I said, our youthing population means we have a growing community which needs growing housing, and the housing situation is just not keeping up with the changing needs. We also have a fairly high percentage of families have only one adult at their head for a range of reasons. It could be incarceration, it could be ill health, it could be risk-taking behaviour. There's a whole heap of things that mean we have a lot of single-parent families in our communities, mine included. My husband died. There's nothing I can do about that. It's just the circumstances I find myself in. But single-parent families face a whole heap of economic barriers because there's only one person, and you have to make a choice between, do I go to work every day or do I hang out with my kids and raise my own children myself instead of the usual arguments, all the usual nonsense single parent families have to go through. But it becomes an economic barrier because there's only one income. It's just, I did not. Apologies. Distracted myself and forgot where I was. So I guess the question I want to pose for you to reflect on at the end of this short video is about the great Australian dream, the dream of home ownership. And I know this can be a challenging topic for many people in our society today because it's not just Aboriginal people who have challenges obtaining secure housing, but we do have some challenges. And the question I want to ask is, why shouldn't Aboriginal people share in the great Australian dream? Because I think we should, if we want to. Not everybody does, but if we want to, we definitely should be able to share in the great Australian dream. Anyway, that's your lot. You can reflect on that question to your heart's content. I'm sure I'll see you in class. Go away, you.